I'm relatively new to art, and it's been about a year or two since I've started doing art on my own. Somehow, I've made surprising progress despite the small amount of time and effort I've put into it. The cause was likely because I spent a lot of time early on just enjoying art, and with my recent start in game development, I got A-Sprite so that I could make pixel art for my games. The very first game I made used very low resolution pixel art, being 10 by 10 pixels in size. I really wanted to do more realistic art for my game, but because of my current level of experience, I knew that I could not expect myself to make hyper-realistic art. And I thought that potentially raster art would work, since it's what I'm used to. It would be slightly easier than pixel art, but the drawback is that it would take longer to make and would be difficult to animate. I decided that the best choice would be to compromise. 32 by 32 pixels would allow me to harness the speed of pixel art while still being able to include the detail that I'm wanting. I'm definitely still getting used to higher resolution pixel art, and my current art is okay, but I don't think it'll be sufficient once the game is released. The problem most likely comes, once again, from my lack of experience. Though, I'm considering trying out a drawing tablet or just drawing on my Android tablet like I usually do. It seems like the majority of people still just recommend using a mouse. In the end, I have to remind myself that my art doesn't have to be perfect, especially at the beginning. There will be plenty of time to iterate in the future, and it's more important that the game actually exists before looking good. Before I started working on the game, one of the things I thought about was creating resizable windows. It's an interesting challenge that seems really simple at first, but is surprisingly complicated once you get into the logistics of it. I'm sure that most game engines support this automatically without much setup. However, I'm not using a custom game engine. I'm using a custom engine built off of a framework. And frameworks, being lightweight by nature, do not have tools for creating resizable windows, and you have to set everything else up yourself. You'd think that I could just let the user change the size of the window, and that it would just work. I wish it was that simple. See, if you let the user change the size of the window, the game doesn't know that the window size has actually changed. So if you have an object that is centered and you increase the window size, that object will not move at all. It will just no longer be centered. When you shrink the window, the player can actually just get pushed off of the screen. Another common problem is that a player with a very large screen will be able to see much more than a player with a small screen. So you're probably thinking, wow, I did not know something so seemingly simple needed so much thought under the hood. Luckily, the solution is pretty simple. It just needs some setup. This is what inspired me to create the camera object for my game engine. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's an object that modifies what is being shown on the screen, allowing the user to zoom, move which part of the screen is being displayed, and even rotate the screen. I don't fully understand the logic myself, but what it does is create a matrix of data which is passed to the computer before it draws to the screen to know how to affect the images being drawn. To solve this issue with the player being pulled off the screen when the window size changes, you can just create a game camera that updates its position to the center of the screen when the window is resized. This fixes the problem completely. Very simple. And every time the window is resized, it just updates the logic to move all the images back to the center of the window. However, this still leaves a problem with the game showing more of the screen when the window becomes bigger. Surprisingly, this was a pretty simple solution. You just need to make another camera, or you could modify the pre-existing one, that zooms in or out when the window is changed. All you need to do is divide the current window's height by the game's default height. You might be wondering though, why do you use height instead of width? And I wondered that too. Apparently, it's because using height is much more consistent. You can get some pretty funny scenes if someone is using an ultra-wide monitor. It'll make the game zoom in really close. But most monitors do follow a very similar height, so it's the best choice for consistency. And once you implement this, you'll see that images will always grow when the window is expanded and shrink when the window size is decreased. I had an interesting experience once I got the player's foundation set up. I wanted to make a movement system that felt really good, and for some reason I thought of trying out a physics-based system. My thought process was that the player would still slide a little bit after stopping. I'm pretty sure several games do this, but now that I'm thinking about it, I'm second-guessing myself. I managed to mess this system up really bad. Whenever the player moved, it looked like they were sliding on ice, and you could throw them around the screen like they were attached to a rope. This movement system definitely didn't fit my game. I could potentially have made it work by making the friction really high, but I just decided to do a normal movement system, where the player moves when a button is pressed and stops if not. Side note, controller input is much simpler to code than keyboard input. To get keyboard input, you have to check each key that is assigned to movement, which is a minimum of 4 lines, and add a movement value to the player's position. For controller, all you have to do is add the controller's left stick axis multiplied by a movement value to the player position. Bonus points if you account for stick drift, which is also very simple. Not that either of them are hard to code, I just find it interesting how much faster controller input is to implement. I also took the time to make a controller class for my game. It's not necessary, but it's incredibly convenient in the long run. It allows me to define my controls, and all I have to do to check if an action is supposed to happen is call the proper function in the game controller class. It makes it easy to change the controls for the game because they're all in one spot, so I'll only have to make a change once and the whole system will automatically update. Programming is often a weird hobby where you go into something thinking that it'll be so simple. But once you actually get into the project you've been thinking about, you realize that it's really complicated. This does happen surprisingly often, and I've fallen for this trap on many occasions when starting a new project. Apart from the resizable windows, this also happened when I wanted to make objects that the player could pick up in my game. I had lots of fun making rocks, and with my game being inspired by Rainworld, it was very natural. However, they serve a much different purpose, which I'll discuss in a later video once I've actually implemented that system. For some reason, there are lots of moving parts in the rocks system, but I was able to compress everything down into a system that I felt was alright using. I definitely feel like there is room for improvement, but it does work well. There is a simple state system that makes sure the rock behaves differently if it is held or dropped, but now that I think of it, I'm not really sure you can call it a state system. The actual code is just a very simple check if the object is held or not when doing certain actions. I feel like a state system would actually create different areas that act depending on the state, but it's close enough. It was also surprisingly complicated to make a system for the objects and the player to communicate data between each other. I think most people would use events, but in my system, I used functions to communicate. I don't really like using events, which is probably just because I am not used to using them. But even if I did, I would have probably made some really bad mistakes, so I don't think it's that much of an issue. There is basically just a function that updates a variable that stores whether the object is held or not, and everything else relies on how the developer, aka me, decides to use that data. I probably could go and just use a more event-based approach, but I feel like if I did, it would basically just be the same system, but more complicated. And with the system set up, when the player clicks a button to pick something up, it'll reference all the items in the room and sees if any of them are able to be picked up. In the event that one or more of the items are close enough to be picked up, it marks the first item in that list as picked up, sets its position to the player, and, while it's picked up, runs a unique drawing and update logic. And when the player drops the item is marked as dropped, sets its position to be beside the player, and the player marks that they are no longer holding an item. Like I said previously, my game is heavily inspired by Rainworld, and with the fact that the game is centered around survival, I naturally added spears to my game. For some reason, this was way too complicated. Drawing the sprite was fine, creating the class was fine, but I had so many problems with the difference between the way I thought angles worked, the way angles worked in Foster, the framework I'm using, and the way angles actually worked mathematically. For context, mathematically, an angle of 0 degrees points to the right, and if you add to that angle, it turns counterclockwise, or left. As an artist, my spear art pointed up for the default angle, and for some reason in Foster, adding to an angle makes it turn clockwise, or right. This small difference in the two systems created such a big headache for me. The first thing I implemented was another control for my game class, so I could just call a simple function to check if the player was trying to throw a spear. I just titled it Action, since I could also reuse this control for many other things. Basically, when the action button is pressed, the player tells the spear, assuming they hold one, that they want to throw it. So the spear marks itself as dropped, ensures it is in the correct spot, and the player marks that they no longer have an item in their hand. The next step in throwing a spear is to actually get the direction the spear is thrown and rotate it. The first part, getting the direction, was easy. I just made the last direction the player moved public to the items in the room. It then uses some trigonometry to convert that direction into an angle. But I made a mistake the first time I tried making this. I used a basic trigonometry function at first. This was technically the correct move, but it didn't properly account for the direction the player was moving in, and as a result gave inconsistent directions, and because of the aforementioned differences between mathematical angles and angles in Foster, I needed to add an offset to the angle that was calculated to work properly. This took me a really long time to figure out, and for some reason I couldn't wrap my head around the differences. Eventually, I got the hang of it, and now, looking back, it is really simple. But it was so hard to get all the angle calculations figured out. It took me 2 or 3 days just to get everything working simply. But now that it's all finished, once the spear is thrown and all the information is updated, I can add an initial velocity to it, the force of being thrown, and subtract from that velocity until the spear stops. Technically, you're not supposed to subtract from the spear's velocity. It makes it look like it's sliding rather than being thrown, but I'll fix it soon enough. Also, thank you to all who are watching this. I didn't really realize that my game was a good idea, and I'm really surprised that so many people are taking an interest into it. I hope you all have a good day. I'm sorry for not being a very good content creator, but I'm very grateful for you guys bearing with me. God bless. Yeshua loves you. Have a good night or day. It depends on what time you wake up. I'm probably going to get this video published late.